June 26, 1944. Hollandia Air Force Base, Netherlands, New Guinea. Two officers leaned over a chessboard, concentrating. Lieutenant Colonel Charles MacDonald was winning. His opponent, Lieutenant Colonel Merrill Smith, operations officer of the Satan's Angels fighter group, was planning his next move. Then someone knocked on the screen door. MacDonald looked up. A man was standing there, civilian clothes, middle-aged, calm-faced. He quietly introduced himself. At first, the name went unnoticed. MacDonald was engrossed in his chess game. The commoner repeated the introduction with a gentle confidence that made MacDonald stop and actually listen this time. Charles Lindbergh. Charles Lindbergh. America's most famous aviator. The man who flew solo across the Atlantic in 1927. Standing here in the middle of nowhere, thousands of miles from home, asking to talk about P-38 combat operations. Neither of them knew it yet, but this interruption would change everything. What would happen over the next 6 weeks would revolutionize the way America fought air wars in the Pacific. It would extend the combat radius of the most advanced fighter aircraft in the field by nearly 400 miles. It would make impossible missions routine, and it would save countless lives. But here's what makes this story truly remarkable. The man who would do all this had never even flown a P-38 until 3 days ago. He was 42 years old. He was a civilian. And the technique he was about to teach would go against everything these fighter pilots had been trained to fly. This is the story of how one man's insight into fuel efficiency, learned 17 years ago over the frigid Atlantic, changed the course of air warfare in the Pacific. It is the story of institutional resistance overcome by incontrovertible evidence, of pilots learning to trust math over instinct, of a controversial figure finding redemption through technical mastery. And it starts with a simple question. How does a fighter jet fly 400 miles farther than anyone else can? Let's go back to understand why we came here. May 20th, 1927. Roosevelt Field, New York. A young male pilot named Charles Lindbergh climbed into a silver monoplane called the Spirit of St. Louis. He was 25 years old. He was attempting what many experts considered suicide. He would fly from New York to Paris, alone, non-stop, more than 3,600 miles over open ocean. The plane was essentially a flying tank. It carried 450 gallons of fuel in tanks so large they completely obscured his forward vision. Lindbergh had to navigate by periscope and gauge. No radio. No parachute. If he crashed into the Atlantic, he would die. What most people don't know about this flight is that Lindbergh's greatest skill wasn't courage. It was fuel management. He spent months calculating fuel consumption precisely. He obsessively tested the right whirlwind engine. He understood that this flight wasn't about courage. It was about math. 33.5 hours later, he landed at Le Bourget Airport in Paris. He had 85 gallons of fuel left. Experts had predicted he would run out of fuel over the ocean. They were wrong. Lindbergh had achieved fuel efficiency they thought impossible. He became the most famous man in the world overnight. But while everyone was praising his bravery, Lindbergh was thinking about fuel efficiency. He was thinking about how he had pushed the engine beyond what the manufacturer thought was possible. He was thinking about optimum operating limits, about the relationship between manifold pressure and propeller RPM, about fuel mixture settings and designated airspeed. For most pilots, these were just numbers in a handbook. For Lindbergh, they became an obsession. Throughout the 1930s, Lindbergh flew survey flights for Pan American Airways. He mapped trans-Pacific and transatlantic routes. He accumulated thousands of hours of testing long-range flight techniques. He realized that published range figures were averages, not limits. Every engine had an ideal balance point where power output, fuel consumption, and mechanical stress were perfectly balanced. Finding that ideal balance point became his specialty. He became one of the world's leading experts on long-distance flying. But then his life took a dark turn. Lindbergh believed that America should stay out of European conflicts. He headed the America First Committee. He argued strongly against American involvement in World War II. He made statements about Nazi aviation technology, which led to accusations of Nazi sympathies. President Franklin Roosevelt hated him. On April 29, 1941, Roosevelt publicly compared Lindbergh to a Civil War traitor. That was the extent of the president's contempt for him. Lindbergh, angry and humiliated, resigned as an Air Force Reserve colonel. Then, December 7, 1941 happened. Pearl Harbor. America entered the war. Lindbergh tried to re-enlist in the Army Air Corps. He wanted to fly combat missions. Roosevelt personally made sure that would never happen. Lindbergh would never wear an American uniform again in this war. But expertise found a way. If Lindbergh couldn't serve in the military, he would become a civilian engineering consultant. He joined the United Aircraft Corporation. He worked with Chance Vaught on the F-4U Corsair. He troubleshooted B-24 production at Ford's Willow Run plant. He flew dangerous high-altitude test flights in the P-47 Thunderbolt. His technical contributions were great, but they were not enough. Lindbergh wanted to fight. In early 1904, he saw an opportunity. United Aircraft wanted to study the feasibility of a twin-engine fighter. The only American representative in this category was the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. Lindbergh convinced the company to send him to the Pacific as a technical representative to observe the P-38 in combat. The trip was authorized by the Navy Department but kept secret from the White House. Neither Roosevelt nor the Secretary of the Navy knew Lindbergh was on his way to a war zone. The mission started out as an observation mission, but it quickly became something more. Marine Corps aviation officers invited Lindbergh to fly as an observer on combat missions. On May 21, 1944, Lindbergh made his first combat flight with the 222nd Marine Fighter Squadron near Rabaul. The Marines called it an observation mission. Lindbergh flew with his machine gun hot. He quickly demonstrated that practical expertise far exceeded theory. He instructed Corsair pilots to safely take off with twice the bomb load. Marines were losing planes to accidental overloading. Lindbergh's meticulous analysis of power settings and weight distribution reduced accidents and increased attack capability. News spread across the Pacific theater. The famed pilot was flying combat missions as a civilian, solving operational problems that had plagued military pilots for months. By mid-June, Lindbergh had become interested in the P-38 Lightning. He had heard that the 475th Fighter Squadron, Satan's Angels, was one of the most famous Lightning units in the Pacific. On June 20th, he spent an hour and 20 minutes checking in on a P-38. It was his first time flying the distinctive twin fuselage fighter. 6 days later, he walked through that screen door and interrupted MacDonald's game of checkers. MacDonald was only 29 years old and already a 10-victory ace. He commanded the 475th Fighter Squadron, one of the highest-scoring P-38 units in the Pacific. His squadron flew the latest P-38J models with improved intercoolers and increased fuel capacity. These Lightnings were the longest-range fighters in the Pacific, capable of performing missions no other aircraft could. But even with external fuel tanks, operational range was limited. Missions to distant targets often left little fuel for combat maneuvers. Pilots frequently returned to base with uncomfortably low fuel reserves. Several planes were lost when weather forced them to circle beyond their fuel capacity. MacDonald initially politely declined Lindbergh and returned to his game of chess. But when Lindbergh explained that General Hutchison had sent him to discuss P-38 combat operations, MacDonald listened attentively. After a brief conversation, MacDonald asked Lindbergh if he would like to fly a mission the following day. Lindbergh agreed. The mission would begin at dawn. Instead of returning to headquarters, MacDonald asked Lindbergh to stay at Camp 475. As Lindbergh settled into an extra bed, news spread quickly throughout the unit. Charles Lindbergh was flying with Satan's angels. Reactions among the pilots were mixed. Some were eager to meet the legendary pilot. Others were skeptical. Some questioned whether a 42-year-old civilian, famous or not, could handle modern warfare. Major Thomas McGuire, a 15 victory ace who would end the war as America's second highest-scoring fighter pilot with 38 confirmed kills, wanted to see what the old man could do. The morning of June 27th arrived. The weather was bad. A steady rain fell. By 10:30, when the last flight took off, conditions had improved. MacDonald led 4 planes toward Jeffman Island and Samate Airfield. Lindbergh flew Blue 3 on McGuire's wing. The remaining plane was piloted by Merrill Smith, an 8 victory ace. MacDonald watched Lindbergh move into perfect formation on McGuire's wing. For someone who had only been testing P-38s a few days earlier, his formation was perfect. The mission involved strafing an enemy barge in Cabo's Bay. Lindbergh weaved through anti-aircraft fire. His cannons and machine guns cleared the target. The mission was a success. All 4 planes returned safely. But what happens after landing is of greater significance than any combat action. The crew chiefs noticed something unusual. When the ground crew inspected Lindbergh's P-38s after several missions, they discovered a pattern. His planes always returned with significantly more fuel than other pilots flying similar missions. After a 6.5-hour armed reconnaissance mission on July 1st, Lindbergh landed with 210 gallons of fuel remaining. Other pilots on the same mission returned with fuel gauges showing low. On July 3rd, the group escorted 16 B-25 bombers on a raid on Jeffman Island. After the attack, the Lightnings went hunting for barges. Within an hour, 2 pilots reported low fuel and turned back. Lindbergh continued the mission. His fuel gauge showed adequate reserves. This was no fluke. This happened mission after mission. Somehow, this civilian pilot was flying the same aircraft on the same mission and consistently returning with more fuel than the veterans who had been flying P-38s for months. MacDonald noticed the discrepancy and called a meeting. 2 days after Lindbergh arrived, the colonel gathered the pilots of the 475th Regiment in the recreation room. The facilities were primitive. A hard-packed dirt floor under a thatched roof, a ping-pong table, a few decks of cards. Under bright, unshaded bulbs, MacDonald got to work. He formally introduced Lindbergh and asked him to explain why he always carried more fuel than any other pilot in the group. The room was silent. Every pilot listened. They wanted to know the secret. How could this civilian do what they could not? Lindbergh stood before the assembled pilots. What he said next would change P-38 operations throughout the Pacific Theater. He explained the cruise control techniques he employed on the Lightning. Standard operating procedure taught to all P-38 pilots called for flying at 2,200 to 2,400 RPM, with the fuel mixture set to auto-rich. This setting provided good power and was considered safe for the engine. However, it was also wasteful. Lindbergh explained that by reducing engine speed from the standard 2,200 RPM to 1,600 RPM, setting the fuel mixture to auto-lean instead of auto-rich, and slightly increasing the manifold pressure to compensate for the lower RPM, the pilot could significantly reduce fuel consumption without losing effective airspeed. The specific settings he recommended were 1,600 RPM at 30 inches 76 centimeters of mercury manifold pressure with the mixture set to auto-lean and an indicated airspeed of 185 mph. These settings reduced fuel consumption to about 70 gallons, about 2.1 liters per hour, or about 2 6 miles per gallon, about 2.6 km. Lindbergh predicted these techniques would extend Lightning's radius by 400 miles, allowing for 9-hour missions. When he finished his presentation half an hour later, the room fell silent again. But this silence was different. It was uncomfortable. The pilots were thinking about many disturbing things. First, the concept of a 9-hour flight was unpalatable to someone who had found 7-hour missions to be torture. The P-38 cockpit was cramped. The pilots sat in parachutes with a life raft and paddles underneath. Their survival suits were uncomfortable. 7 hours in that cockpit was beyond human endurance. 9 hours seemed impossible. Second, and more worryingly, Lindbergh recommended that they run the engine at a setting they had been specifically instructed to avoid. The combination of low RPM and high manifold pressure is known as over-square running. Military flight training emphasized that over-square running would damage the engine. Detonation would then cause the cylinder head to overheat, leading to catastrophic engine failure. Pilots are taught that if the manifold pressure exceeds the RPM by more than a few inches, the engine is in danger of blowing up. This is drilled into every pilot's training. It's a basic rule of engine management. It's a rule you can't break. Now, this resident suggests that they should regularly operate the engine in conditions that they have been warned are dangerous. Skepticism was palpable in the room. Many of the pilots glanced at each other. Some shook their heads. One pilot openly called Lindbergh's technique dangerous. Think about what was happening here. These were fighter pilots. They were flying missions deep into enemy territory, over vast stretches of ocean. If their engines failed, they would die. Either they would drown in the Pacific or they would be captured by the Japanese. An engine failure was not an inconvenience. It was a death sentence. And now someone is telling them to operate the engine in a way that every manual, every instructor, every experienced pilot says will cause engine failure. Why did they believe this? Why would they risk their lives on the word of a 42-year-old civilian who had been flying a P-38 for less than a week? But MacDonald understood something important. Lindbergh wasn't just talking. He flew combat missions using these setups. His P-38 never suffered an engine failure. His aircraft repeatedly returned with fuel reserves, giving him operational flexibility that other pilots didn't have. The colonel decided to test the technique in action. If successful, the 475th Division would have a decisive combat advantage. If it failed, they would know it immediately. Over the next week, pilots began cautiously testing Lindbergh's flight setup. Initial flights were short, allowing the pilots to quickly return to base if the engine showed signs of trouble. The first pilots to test the technique reported with concern that their engines sounded different at low RPM. The deep, rumbling sound of the Allison V-1710 changed character. But the temperature gauge remained normal. Oil pressure remained within acceptable limits. Cylinder head temperature, a key indicator of detonation, actually ran cooler than at higher RPM settings. As confidence grew, pilots began to apply Lindbergh's technique to long-duration missions. The fuel savings were undeniable. Missions that had previously required a quick return after attacking a target now involved extended combat air patrols. Flights that had previously required pilots to closely monitor fuel consumption now ended with comfortable reserves. The P-38's effective combat radius, previously about 570 miles, expanded to 700 miles, then 750 miles. Pilots found they could engage targets that were considered beyond the Lightning's capabilities, fight for 15 minutes over the target area, and still return with an hour's worth of fuel. The transformation was revolutionary. Skepticism dissipated as each mission demonstrated the effectiveness of the technique. Lindbergh flew regularly with the 475th, racking up combat hours and teaching by example. He commanded flights, proving that a civilian observer could handle combat as well as any military pilot. On missions, he commanded. His call sign was simple, Mr. Lindbergh. But Lindbergh doesn't just tell pilots what to do. He explains why it works, and understanding why makes all the difference. This is physics. An aircraft engine produces power by burning fuel to create pressure that pushes the piston. The amount of fuel burned per unit of time determines fuel consumption. The goal is to maximize efficiency, producing the most power with the least fuel consumption. Traditional high RPM settings produce a lot of power, but waste fuel because the engine runs fast, burning unnecessary fuel. By reducing RPM and increasing intake pressure, the same power can be produced with fewer combustion cycles, each using fuel more efficiently. The lean mixture setting further improves performance by providing just enough fuel for complete combustion, eliminating the excess fuel used in auto-enrichment mode to cool the engine at high power settings. But here's the key information that helps pilots understand why this isn't dangerous. The engine doesn't explode because the power setting, while exceeding the squared ratio, isn't actually high-power operation. The 30-inch manifold pressure is moderate, well below the 60-inch wartime emergency power setting used for takeoff and combat. The lower RPM actually reduces mechanical stress on the engine's components. This technique is not dangerous. It is just different from what pilots have been taught. And Lindbergh's expertise came from years of experience no other military pilot had. His 1927 transatlantic flight taught him that published specifications were a starting point, not a limit. His work with Pan American Airways in the 1930s, surveying trans-Pacific and transatlantic routes, gave him thousands of hours to experiment with fuel management. He had been obsessing about fuel efficiency for 17 years. These fighter pilots, no matter how good they were, had been flying P-38s for months at a time. Lindbergh had been thinking about this problem long before most of them learned to fly. The P-38 also had an advantage that made testing less risky than it seemed. Dual engines. If one engine failed due to experimental flight techniques, the other could carry the pilot home. In the vast Pacific, where mechanical failure meant death by drowning or capture by the Japanese. Most single-engine fighter pilots flew cautiously, but the P-38's redundancy created room to explore the safe zone. And Lindbergh knew that the supply situation was acceptable. Allison was shipping spare V-1710 engines and spare parts to the Pacific in large quantities. If an engine needed to be replaced after testing, the ground crew could quickly install a new propulsion system. The operational advantage of extended range allowed for a small risk of increased engine wear. This calculation proved to be correct. No P-38 engines were damaged due to Lindbergh's flying techniques. By late July 1944, Lindbergh's cruise control techniques were widely adopted by the P-38 units of the 5th Air Force. The success of the 475th Fighter Group was undeniable. Word spread to other squadrons. Pilots talked. Ground crews compared fuel consumption data. Other commanders wanted the same operational advantage that the Satan's Angels now enjoyed. Lindbergh also gave demonstrations to pilots from other units. He patiently explained techniques, answered technical questions, and addressed engine safety concerns. Adoption was not immediate or widespread, but it was steady. Then came July 28, 1944. This day marked Lindbergh's most memorable moment with the 475th Squadron. The mission was to escort bombers to the Seram area, flying with 433 Squadron. Lindbergh commanded the 3rd Blue Squadron in a 4-ship flight over El Paputi Bay. The Blue Squadron encountered enemy aircraft. 2. Mitsubishi Ki-51. Sonyas appeared. These were Japanese light bombers used for reconnaissance and ground attack. They were returning from a search for their missing comrades. The Sonyas belonged to the 73rd Independent Flying Squadron. One was flown by the unit commander, Captain Saburo Shimada. The other was flown by Sergeant Yokogi. The American fighters attacked. The Sonyas were outnumbered, slower, less maneuverable, and less heavily armed than the Lightnings. They should have been easily shot down. But Shimada was an experienced pilot and had no intention of going down easy. The engagement turned into a running battle. The P-38s of the 9th Fighter Squadron spotted the Sonyas first and were already engaging them when MacDonald's squadron arrived. Shimada's co-pilot, Sergeant Yokogi, was hit by a shell from Lieutenant Wade Lewis. The Sonya's left wing caught fire. As the enemy aircraft straightened to escape, Lieutenant J.C. Haslip sneaked up behind and fired a long burst. The Sonya, heavily damaged, went up in smoke and crashed into the sea. But Shimada's Sonya continued to fight. For 30 minutes, the Japanese captain skillfully outmaneuvered a swarm of attacking P-38s. He flew into steep bank runs, wingtips spewing condensation as he maneuvered the Sonya into full-speed turns. The P-38 pilot tried to stay on target but could not keep his aim. The slower Japanese aircraft could maneuver inside the faster American fighters. Captain Danforth Miller, MacDonald's co-pilot, had the Sonya in sight but lost sight of it when Shimada made a sharp left turn. Miller's plane fell 80 feet behind. Then Shimada did something unexpected. Instead of continuing to dodge, he turned straight toward the approaching Lindbergh. The two planes flew head-on at nearly 500 miles per hour. Think about this moment. Lindbergh had flown thousands of hours. He was one of the most experienced pilots alive. But he had never faced an enemy plane trying to kill him. Not like this. Not face-to-face with approaching death at 500 miles. The moment was terrifyingly clear. Shimada held his ground. Whether he was trying to mount a surprise attack or simply hoping for a direct gunfight. The Japanese captain decided to ram the enemy ship. Lindbergh instinctively aimed at the Sonya's radial engine and pulled the trigger. The P-38's armament, a 20mm cannon and 4 .50 caliber machine guns clustered in the nose, exploded in 6 seconds. Lindbergh held the trigger. Bullets and shells slammed into the front of the Sonya. The Mitsubishi's propeller slowed noticeably. Smoke billowed from the engine. But Shimada stood his ground. At the last moment, Lindbergh suddenly accelerated. His P-38 passed the damaged Sonya at a safe distance. Shimada's plane dove. Other P-38s fired more salvos. The Sonya continued to dive, belching black smoke, until it crashed into the sea at high speed. A white spray marked the impact. Spray spread out in concentric circles on the surface. Then the waves merged with the sea. The surface of the water returned to normal. Captain Saburo Shimada and his observer were killed. Back at base, the pilot's merits were discussed. Several pilots had scored hits on Sonya. MacDonald, Miller, and Lindbergh all scored hits. But it was Lindbergh's direct hit that severely damaged the plane, slowed the propeller, and started its fatal dive. Unofficially, the pilots agreed. Lindbergh had scored his first and only victory. The victory was not recorded in the 475th's official war records. Lindbergh was a civilian, and his combat participation was already sporadic. Recording an official kill would have raised questions that could have ended his service in the unit. But everyone there knew what had happened. The famous pilot, a 42-year-old civilian, had proven himself in the best possible way. He had faced an enemy pilot in combat and had won. 3 days later, on August 1st, Lindbergh was nearly dead. The mission was a fighter sweep of the Palau Islands. The squadron encountered Japanese Zeros. In the ensuing air battle, Lindbergh found himself in a fierce dogfight with a Zero pilot who nearly shot him down. Only MacDonald's intervention saved his life. Turn right. Turn right. MacDonald attacked the Zero himself, pulling it away from Lindbergh's stern. The near miss convinced the 5th Air Force that enough was enough. Lindbergh had proven his technique effective. He flew about 50 combat missions across the Pacific, including about 25 P-38 missions with the 475th. He shot down one enemy plane. He nearly lost his life. It was time to bring him back to the United States before something irreversible happened. On August 12, 1944, Lindbergh left Hollandia for home. The pilots of the 475th Fighter Group gathered to see him off. Their respect for the civilian engineering representative was sincere. He not only taught them techniques that extended their range of combat, he flew with them, fought with them, and proved himself in conditions where status and prestige meant nothing. The impact of Lindbergh's fuel-saving techniques extended far beyond the 475th Fighter Wing. By October 1944, P-38 units across the Pacific were adopting variations of his cruise control setup. The exact numbers varied slightly by unit and conditions, but the general principle was lower engine RPM, higher manifold pressure, leaner fuel mixture, all combined to dramatically extend range. The operational implications are profound. Previously inaccessible targets were now accessible. Japanese bases that had been immune to fighter escorts now faced P-38s, with enough fuel to fight over their targets and return home safely. The extended range allowed fighters to escort bombers on missions that had previously been flown without escorts, or at all. Long-range fighter sweeps could penetrate deeper into Japanese-controlled territory. P-38 squadrons in Dutch New Guinea would soon fly 950 miles to their targets, fight for 15 minutes, and return to base. Such missions were impossible before Lindbergh's technique became routine. Think about the strategic implications of this. Expanding the area of operations was not simple. In the second half of 1944, increasing the combat radius allowed operations to be carried out in direct support of MacArthur's advance into the Philippines. Airfields that could not be supported by existing fighter aircraft would become viable forward bases. Invasion plans that required waiting for closer airfields could be executed more quickly. Strategic impact was measured not just in miles, but in time. Operations that would have taken months could now be accomplished in weeks, with fighter aircraft that could reach farther and faster. This technology also saves lives. Pilots who previously returned to base with their fuel gauges showing no fuel now have fuel reserves for emergencies. Bad weather forcing a go-around no longer means certain loss of the aircraft. Pilots wounded in combat have a better chance of making it home. Reserve fuel provides a safety margin, directly reducing combat losses from non-combat causes. The extended range was especially useful during the liberation of the Philippines. When MacArthur's forces invaded Leyte in October 1944, P-38s from bases in New Guinea and Morotai provided combat support over distances that had been impossible just a few months earlier. The difference between approaching a target with no fuel reserves and approaching a target with an hour of fuel means the difference between providing effective cover and just showing up. It means the difference between being able to engage enemy fighters and having to withdraw immediately. It means the difference between supporting ground forces and abandoning them. However, the adoption of these techniques remained controversial. Some commanders initially resisted, concerned about engine reliability. Some pilots remained skeptical, trusting their training over civilian advice. Some maintenance officers worried about increased engine wear. But the evidence is incontrovertible. Units using Lindbergh's techniques report no increase in engine failure rates. Fuel consumption data shows significant improvements. Mission reports document successful operations that were previously impossible. By late 1944, Lindbergh's cruise control techniques were officially incorporated into P-38 operating procedures. What had initially been the observations of a civilian engineer had become standard doctrine. The United States Army Air Forces published updated cruise control charts for the P-38 that reflected Lindbergh's findings. Pilot training materials were revised to include proper lean peak mixture maneuvers. The broader story of Lindbergh's service in the Pacific reveals a man driven by complex motives. His pre-war isolationism made him a controversial figure. His comments on aviation technology in Nazi Germany led to accusations of Nazi sympathies. His public opposition to America's entry into World War II damaged his relationship with President Roosevelt. When war broke out, Lindbergh found himself an outcast, even though he was one of America's most talented pilots. But in the Pacific theater, far from the politics of Washington, Lindbergh found salvation through his technical prowess. The Marine Corps and Army Air Corps pilots who flew with him judged him not on his political stance, but on his flying skills and courage. Major Richard Bong, America's top ace pilot with 40 victories, told a United Press reporter that Lindbergh was as good a pilot as any of us. If General Kenny had let him, he would have been out there killing Japanese every day. A review from someone of Bong's stature means more than any political rehabilitation could ever bring. Lindbergh proved his worth where the evidence mattered most: in combat. After returning to the United States in mid-August 1944, Lindbergh continued to make tonique technical contributions to the war effort. In October 1944, he participated in a joint Army-Navy conference on fighter aircraft performance at Patuxent River Naval Air Station, Maryland. He flew and evaluated captured Japanese aircraft, providing detailed information on enemy capabilities. He continued to advise United Aircraft and other manufacturers, addressing problems that arose during combat operations. The specifications of what Lindbergh achieved show a significant improvement. The P-38J Lightning had an internal fuel capacity of 410 gallons, about 1670 liters in standard fuel tanks, 2 90-gallon main fuel tanks, 2 60-gallon reserve tanks, and 2 55-gallon auxiliary fuel tanks, along with drop-in auxiliary fuel tanks. Total capacity could exceed 1,000 gallons, about 3,700 liters. At standard cruise speed of 200 RPM and a rich auto-fuel mixture. Fuel consumption was significantly higher than with Lindbergh's method. Lindbergh's technique reduced fuel consumption to about 70 gallons per hour. Combat radius increased from about 570 miles to 750 miles with the same combat and reserves, an improvement of 31%. For missions requiring maximum range, auxiliary fuel tanks combined with cruise flight techniques can enable flights lasting nearly 9 hours and over 1,000 miles. These capabilities transformed operations in the Pacific. The strategic island-hopping campaign that characterized MacArthur's advance through New Guinea and into the Philippines depended on air superiority at every stage. Fighter range determined which islands could be bypassed and which needed direct attack to provide airfields. By extending the range of fighter aircraft, Lindbergh's techniques allowed for more aggressive battle planning. Islands that would have required costly amphibious assaults could now be bypassed because fighters could reach targets from more distant bases. Some historians mistakenly attribute Lindbergh's extended range technique to the April 1943 interception and shoot-down of Japanese Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's transport aircraft. That mission, flown by P-38s from the 339th Fighter Squadron based on Guadalcanal, exceeded the Lightning's range. But Lindbergh had nothing to do with it. He would not arrive in the Pacific Theater until more than a year later. What Lindbergh contributed was to make such extreme long-range missions routine rather than exceptional. The human element of Lindbergh's achievement deserves emphasis. He was 42 when he was deployed to the Pacific, flying combat missions against pilots 20 years his junior. The physical demands of flying in high-gravity conditions, the pressure of combat, the discomfort of 7 to 9 hour flights in a cramped cockpit all took their toll on him. But Lindbergh never asked for special treatment. He flew the same missions, faced the same dangers, and followed the same procedures as the young lieutenants and captains who made up the bulk of the 475th. His willingness to demonstrate his techniques through individual demonstrations was key to their acceptance. If he merely lectured on fuel management from the safety of the command post, the pilots would see him as just another theorist who had no understanding of combat realities. By performing missions and constantly proving his techniques effective, he gained credibility that no rank or reputation could bring. The psychological impact of Lindbergh's success was not limited to fuel management. He demonstrated that civilian technical expertise was valuable in combat operations. Military organizations naturally value rank and combat experience, but the complexity of modern warfare requires technical sophistication. Often outside the military chain of command, Lindbergh demonstrated that civilians with specialized knowledge could make significant contributions to combat effectiveness if given the opportunity. His success encouraged military commanders to listen to the opinions of civilian technical representatives from aircraft manufacturers, engine companies, and research organizations. Closer cooperation between military users and civilian developers accelerated the pace of technical innovation throughout the war. The P-38 Lightning itself deserves credit for allowing Lindbergh's techniques to be applied. The dual-engine configuration provided redundancy, which made experimentation safer. The Allison V-1710, though often criticized for its many problems, responded well to careful fuel mixture management. The P-38's fuel system, with multiple fuel tanks and transfer pumps, allowed the pilot to carefully manage fuel. The aircraft's stability made it suitable for long-distance cruising. By late 1944 and early 1945, the P-38 had been replaced in some theaters by the P-51 Mustang, which had better performance at high altitudes and longer range on the same amount of fuel. However, in the Pacific, the P-38 retained its value throughout the war. Its twin engines ensured safety on the water. Its heavy armament provided devastating firepower. Its low to medium altitude maneuverability suited the combat conditions of the Pacific, and its range, especially when using Lindbergh's techniques, was still impressive. The final statistics speak for themselves. The 475th Fighter Squadron, which flew only P-38s, scored 551 aerial victories, making it the top P-38 unit of the war. The second highest-scoring American ace, Major Thomas McGuire, with 38 victories, also flew P-38s with the 475th. The combination of range, firepower, and reliability made it the dominant fighter on the battlefield. The extended range provided by Lindbergh's engineering improved every aspect of P-38 operations. Missions could be flown farther, fought longer, and returned safer. The cumulative impact over thousands of missions and hundreds of thousands of flight hours is immeasurable but real. The story also highlights the sometimes uneasy relationship between expertise and institution. Lindbergh's pre-war political views made him unwelcome in the official military. A personal feud with President Roosevelt prevented Lindbergh from serving in the military. Yet the Army Air Corps desperately needed the expertise Lindbergh possessed. The solution, namely informal civilian status with unofficial combatant rights, was illegal and probably violated existing regulations. But it worked. Institutional rigidity gave way to operational pragmatism. The results were enormously beneficial to the war effort. Think about what would happen if the military were completely rigid. If the commander said, "No, you're a civilian. You can't do the combat mission. You can't train our pilots. We don't need your help." The P-38s would continue to operate at limited ranges. the mission would still be impossible. There would be needless loss of life. Sometimes the greatest contributions come from unexpected places. Sometimes the person with the key knowledge isn't the person you'd expect. Sometimes you have to put aside politics and personal feelings and ask yourself a simple question. Will this help us win? Commanders in the Pacific asked that question. And they decided that yes, Lindbergh's expertise would help them win. So they let him fly. They let him teach. They listened to what he had to say. And the results changed the way America fought in the air. Those who flew with Lindbergh in 1944 never forgot what he taught them. In interviews conducted decades later, former pilots of the 475th spoke with reverence of the civilian pilot who flew alongside them and taught them to fly farther than they thought possible. Colonel Warren Lewis, commander of the 432nd Squadron, accurately recalled Lindbergh's fuel-saving settings decades later. The specifics vary slightly between accounts, reflecting adaptations to different conditions and aircraft models. But the principle is universal, and the results are undeniable. Charles Augustus Lindbergh died of lymphoma on August 26, 1974, at the age of 72, at his home in Kipahulu, Maui. He secretly left Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center in New York on August 17th, arriving in Maui just a week before his death. He was buried about 3 hours after his death in a simple coffin handmade by Hawaiian cowboys in work clothes. The grave was lined with lava rock and black pebbles from the beach at Palapala Ho'omau Church Cemetery. Only 15 people attended. The tombstone is a simple concrete slab with an inscription from Psalm 139. If I spread my wings in the morning and dwell at the uttermost parts of the sea. It was a fitting tribute to a man whose greatest achievements were on wings and the vast sea. A man who crossed the Atlantic alone in 1947. A man who spent 1944 training fighter pilots to fly farther than anyone thought possible across the vast Pacific. His wartime diaries, published in 1970, provide detailed accounts of his service in the Pacific, including his time with the 475th Regiment. These diaries give us the fullest picture of what happened during those 6 weeks in the summer of 1944. Lindbergh's legacy in the Pacific goes beyond the specific techniques he taught. He demonstrated principles that still hold. Technical expertise is essential in combat operations. This may seem obvious, but military organizations can sometimes dismiss technical knowledge if it comes from outside the chain of command. Lindbergh demonstrates that technical expertise deserves respect no matter where it comes from. Civilian experts can make meaningful contributions if given the opportunity. Modern warfare is too complex for any one organization to possess all the necessary expertise. Opening the door to civilian knowledge multiplies effectiveness. Organizational procedures should be reviewed and improved when there is evidence to support change. The P-38 standard flight procedures were not wrong. They were simply incomplete. They represented average performance, not optimal performance. Lindbergh demonstrated that there were better methods. The organization was wise enough to adopt them. Personal testimony is more convincing than abstract reasoning. Lindbergh could write technical reports. He could lecture from headquarters. But none of that would convince fighter pilots the way they did on missions. He risked his life to prove his theory. That earned him respect in a way that words could not. And perhaps most importantly, there is always room for improvement, even in systems that seem fully developed. The P-38 was already a mature aircraft in 1944. It had been in combat for years. Thousands of pilots had flown it. Standard operating procedures had been established and refined. But Lindbergh found a way to improve it by 31%. The lesson is clear. Never assume you have reached your limit. Never accept that the current way is the only way. Ultimately, Lindbergh's achievements in the Pacific represented a unique intersection of specialized expertise and operational need. The Pacific theater of war required extremely long ranges for fighter aircraft. The vast distances between islands, the vastness of the ocean, and the need to escort bombers on long missions all created pressures for extended ranges. Current procedures limit the range of the aircraft below what is technically possible. The P-38 could fly farther. The engines could operate more efficiently. But standard procedures do not take full advantage of the aircraft's capabilities. Lindbergh possessed a unique understanding of fuel management. Thanks to his decades-long focus on efficiency, he had obsessed over the problem since 1927 and had accumulated thousands of hours of testing long-range flight techniques. He understood engines and fuel consumption at a level few pilots had. He had the opportunity to apply that expertise to combat conditions, where results could be measured objectively. Fuel remaining after a mission was not a matter of opinion. Either you had more fuel, or you didn't. The evidence was indisputable. He had the courage to personally demonstrate his techniques, risking his life to prove his theory. He flew combat missions. He faced enemy fire. He engaged Japanese planes. He didn't just talk about his ideas. He demonstrated them. And he humbly worked with his pilots as equals instead of demanding recognition for his reputation. He didn't compete for rank. He didn't demand special treatment. He didn't preach from above. He flew as Blue 3 over other people's squadrons. He followed orders. He proved himself by his actions. All of these elements had to come together for the story to work. Remove just one of them, and the outcome would have been different. If Lindbergh hadn't spent 17 years perfecting fuel-saving techniques, he wouldn't have had the knowledge. If the Pacific theater didn't require extreme range, no one would have cared. If he wasn't willing to fly combat missions, pilots wouldn't have trusted him. If he demanded recognition instead of working as an equal, they would have resented him. Everything had to be perfectly arranged. And it was. For 6 weeks in the summer of 1944, all the necessary elements came together in the right place, at the right time, with the right people. This result changed the course of air warfare in the Pacific. Let's look at what this story is really about. Because on the surface, it's about fuel efficiency, engine settings, and manifold pressures. The technical stuff might sound dry or boring, but that's not what it's really about. This story is about questioning assumptions. Every P-38 pilot was taught that running the engines too square would destroy them. This was not a suggestion. It was a rule. It was drilled into them in training. The instructors told them. The instructors told them. The experienced pilots told them. They all agreed. Don't run the engines too square, or you'll blow them up. And everyone was wrong. Not entirely wrong. Running engines too square at high power can indeed cause problems. But running them too square at moderate power with careful mixture management is not only safe, but optimal. The rules they were taught were incomplete. They were a simplified version of a more complex truth. How many other rules are similar? How many things we accept as absolute truths are really just simplifying estimates? How many possibilities are we missing out on because we never question the limits we've been taught? Lindbergh questioned those limits, and he discovered another 400 miles lurking just ahead. This story is also about redemption. Charles Lindbergh entered the Pacific as a controversial figure. He opposed American entry into the war. The President of the United States hated him. He was not allowed to wear a uniform. He was not allowed to serve officially. He was famous, yes, but his reputation was tainted by his political positions. He could have spent the war giving speeches, selling war bonds, or doing some safe, comfortable job away from danger. No one would have blamed him. He was 42. He had proven his courage in 1927. He didn't have to prove anything to anyone. But that's not what he did. He went to the Pacific. He flew combat missions. He faced enemy fire. He shot down an enemy plane. He nearly died in a dogfight with a Zero. He lived in primitive conditions with men half his age. He flew missions that pushed human endurance to the limits. And he taught. He shared his knowledge freely. He did not hoard expertise or demand recognition. He stood in a primitive recreation room under unshaded lamps and explained his techniques to skeptical fighter pilots. He answered their questions. He addressed their concerns. He flew mission after mission, proving that it worked. The pilots of the 475th Fighter Wing didn't care about his politics. They didn't care about his relationship with Roosevelt. They only cared about whether he could fly, whether he could fight, whether his techniques actually worked. And in every way, he has proven his ability. That is salvation. Not through words, apologies, or political maneuvering, but through action, through power, through courage. Those who flew with him judged him based on what he did, not what he said years ago. That's the fairest judgment we can hope for. This story also talks about the value of expertise. Lindbergh was no better pilot than the veterans of the 475th. Many of them were aces with dozens of kills. They had flown P-38s in combat for months, even years. They knew the plane inside and out. They were the best fighter pilots in the Pacific. But Lindbergh had expertise they didn't. He spent 17 years obsessing over fuel efficiency. He flew long-range survey flights across oceans. He managed fuel consumption on flights where running out of fuel meant death. He tested cruise settings for thousands of hours. That specialized knowledge, though narrow and specific, proves to be extremely valuable when applied to the right problem. We live in an age of specialization. No one can know everything. The mass of human knowledge has become so vast that we have to choose what we want to master. And sometimes, people who master a narrow area of knowledge can solve problems that those who are more general can't. Lindbergh's fuel efficiency expertise seems quaint. It's old-fashioned. It comes from a time when planes were slower and engines were simpler. But when applied to modern fighters operating at extremely long ranges, that old knowledge has become a breakthrough innovation. Never dismiss expertise simply because it seems outdated or limited. Sometimes, experts see solutions that everyone else overlooks. This story is about organizational flexibility. Militaries are inherently hierarchical and rule-based. Good order and discipline require adherence to procedures. Chains of command exist for good reasons. But sometimes institutions need to be flexible. Commanders in the Pacific bent Lindbergh's rules. They allowed a civilian to fly combat missions. They allowed him to carry weapons and attack enemy planes. They gave him unofficial authority that would never have been subject to legal review. They prioritized operational efficiency over bureaucratic precision. That flexibility paid off handsomely. If they had applied the strict regulations, Lindbergh would never have flown. He would never have proven his technique. The P-38 would have continued to operate at a shorter range. The war would have lasted longer. More men would have died. Sometimes the right answer is to break the rules. Not recklessly. Not without good reason. But when the operational benefits clearly outweigh the administrative costs, flexibility will serve the mission better than rigidity. The commanders who approved Lindbergh's participation understood this. They had calculated the risks. They faced potential criticism if something went wrong. But they made the decision that best served the mission and their men. That is leadership. This story is about evidence. Lindbergh could talk forever about his ideas. He could write technical papers, give presentations, but all that would not convince fighter pilots as evidence. And the proof is simple. Fuel gauges don't lie. When Lindbergh repeatedly returned from missions with more fuel than anyone else, that's proof. When pilots tested his techniques and found them to work, that's proof. When missions that seemed impossible became routine, that's proof. You can argue with theories. You can challenge calculations. You can question statements. But you can't argue with the results that are likely to happen. Mission after mission. Flight after flight. Lindbergh understood this. That's why he insisted on flying combat missions himself. That's why he demonstrated his techniques rather than taught them. That's why he risked his life. He knew that proof through personal demonstration was the only way to overcome institutional resistance and entrenched habits. If you want to change the way people do things, especially when you propose something that goes against their training, you need irrefutable evidence. You need to demonstrate, not just talk. You need results that speak louder than words. Lindbergh presented that evidence, and it changed everything. This story is ultimately about human potential. The P-38 Lightning was still the same plane before and after Lindbergh arrived. Same engine, same fuel tank, same aerodynamics. The hardware had not changed at all. But the plane's effective combat radius had increased by 31%. How? The aircraft hasn't changed. Pilots have unlocked capabilities that have long existed. They've learned to operate the aircraft closer to its true potential. They no longer accept published limits as absolute. Think about what that means. The P-38s that flew impossible missions in 1943, barely making it home from exhaustion, could have flown 400 miles farther than they ever could have. The ability was there. The potential was there. They just didn't know how to exploit it. How much untapped potential is there in the systems and tools we use every day? How much possibility are we missing out on simply because we accept current performance as maximum performance? Could we achieve so much more if we questioned our assumptions and explored the limits of what is possible? Lindbergh demonstrated that the impossible is merely difficult, that stated limits are only starting points, not boundaries. That understanding can unlock hidden possibilities. The P-38 Lightning flew until the end of the war, its distinctive twin-stick shape a symbol of American air power in the Pacific. Pilots who flew it still remember it fondly, despite its quirks and challenges. And those who flew it in 1944 and later also remembered the civilians who taught them that the impossible was merely difficult. That stated limits were only starting points, not boundaries. That understanding could unlock hidden possibilities right in front of them. That was Lindbergh's legacy in the Pacific. Not the victories on the battlefield or the missions flown, but the knowledge shared and the techniques taught. He came as an observer and left as a teacher. He came as a celebrity and left as a comrade. And he transformed the capabilities of an airplane simply by understanding how it really worked and having the courage to prove that there were better ways. The Satan's Angels pilots understood what Lindbergh was teaching. They flew farther, fought longer, and returned home safer thanks to knowledge freely shared by a civilian who knew more about fuel efficiency than anyone else in the Pacific. That knowledge, proven in combat and applied across the battlefield, represented one of the most successful technical innovations of the Pacific Air War. And it came not from laboratories or engineering departments, but from one man's mastery of an art he had perfected 17 years earlier over the Atlantic. That proficiency, applied in different situations with different types of aircraft, proved its worth in 1944 as well as in 1927. The principle remains the same. Know the aircraft. Manage resources correctly. Never accept published limits as real limits. Lindbergh lived by that principle. And for 6 weeks in the summer of 1944, he taught it to some of the best fighter pilots in the Pacific, who in turn passed it on to others. Spreading knowledge that changed the way America fought in the air. The game Lindbergh interrupted on June 26, 1944, never ended. McDonald and Smith never returned to the board. They had more important things to do. They had a war to win, and they had just met the man who would help them win it by teaching them to fly 400 miles farther than they could. Sometimes the most important interruptions are the ones that change everything. Sometimes a knock on the door isn't a distraction. It's an opportunity. Sometimes the stranger asking for your time has knowledge that changes the way you see the world. On that hot June day in New Guinea, a 42-year-old civilian stepped through a screen door and changed the course of air warfare in the Pacific. Not through new technology, not through superior tactics, not through overwhelming force, but through insight, through knowledge, through a simple understanding of fuel efficiency that everyone else missed. The impossible became routine. The impossible became possible. And the P-38 Lightning, already a formidable aircraft, became even more deadly as pilots learned to exploit its full potential. That's the power of expertise. That's the value of questioning assumptions. That's the result of courage combined with knowledge. Charles Lindbergh made history in 1927 by flying solo across the Atlantic. He made history again in 1944 by teaching fighter pilots to fly farther than anyone else thought possible. Both achievements required similar qualities: technical mastery, thorough preparation, willingness to challenge conventional wisdom, and the courage to prove theory with practice. The spirit of Saint. Lewis carried Lindbergh across the Atlantic. The techniques he developed on that flight took the P-38 across the Pacific, extending its range, improving its efficiency, and saving lives. From New York to Paris in 1927. From New Guinea to the Philippines in 1944. Different planes, different missions, different times, but the same man, same obsession with fuel efficiency, same will to push the limits of what was accepted. And so it turned out. The impossible became reality only through understanding, preparation, and the courage to trust mathematics over instinct. It is the story of an impossible civilian hoax that made American P-38s virtually invulnerable. Not by magic, not by luck, but by knowledge applied with precision and proven by courage. The greatest victories sometimes come not from new weapons, but from a deeper understanding of the weapons we already have. Lindbergh knew the P-38 better than the pilots who flew it every day, and he shared that knowledge freely, asking for nothing in return other than the chance to demonstrate how it worked. For that, the men of the 475th Fighter Squadron and all the P-38 pilots who benefited from his techniques owe him a debt of gratitude. Not for the fame, not for the name, but for the knowledge he shared and the lives he saved. It is a legacy worth remembering.